Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the last Tuesday session of 2020, other than our current affairs session on Thursday afternoon. But this afternoon, we welcome back Simon Whitehouse. I hope most of you, if not all of you, will remember Simon was with us a few weeks ago and gave us a great tour around Covent Garden, places that we didn't know of, hadn't seen before, didn't know about. So Simon is doing another session for us this afternoon, so I'm delighted to welcome him back. He's going to be talking about Charles Dickens and his book, A Christmas Carol. I suppose really appropriate for this time of the year. Simon is going to explore the story behind the story and travel on a virtual tour looking at the stunning colour illustrations from the first edition and visit the key locations in the City of London where Dickens originally set this story. So, Simon, over to you.
Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. This must be distinctly understood. Otherwise, nothing wonderful can come of the story I am about to relate. Now, those, ladies and gentlemen, are the opening words to A Christmas Carol, written in 1843 by the most famous writer in the world, Charles Dickens. And I am Simon Whitehouse. And I thought, rather like the ghost of Christmas present, past and future, all rolled into one, I would pop up ghost-like in the pages of the first edition of A Christmas Carol, which you can just about see if I lean over to one side, that direction and that direction. But don't worry, we'll be coming back to these illustrations this afternoon. So that's the opening to A Christmas Carol, probably, I would say, the most famous ghost story ever written, and perhaps one of the most famous stories per se ever written. And thank you for having me back today. And as Stuart outlined, I'm delighted to be able to share with you some of the background to A Christmas Carol, and hopefully a chance for everyone to maybe revisit the story if you haven't read it for a long time. Perhaps even if you've never read it at all, it's the perfect time of year, of course, to be reading it. And of course, lockdown, well, we don't need any excuse to revisit old classics, do we? So at this point, ladies and gentlemen, having popped up, I'm going to ask you if you wouldn't mind switching off your cameras at this point, just because it maximizes the bandwidth. So if you could turn off your cameras, and any ones that we can't turn off, perhaps we can do it for you. But if you could just take a moment to switch off your videos, that'd be great. And the talk's going to last about an hour. So what we're going to do is we're going to explore A Christmas Carol, but we're also going to explore some of the Victorian context within the story. And we're also going to talk about the legacy of A Christmas Carol towards the end. So what I'm going to do is start sharing my screen with you. So that's going to take a moment to share. And Stuart, I might just get you to give me the thumbs up just to make sure that you can just see everything to start off with. That's always a good sign.
We're fine. We're fine, Simon.
Fantastic. I still see a few videos on, so I'm just going to see, perhaps Stuart, you might be able to turn off people's videos.
I'll have to ask Michael to do that if he can.
Oh, sorry, Michael. Yeah, okay. That's no problem.
Don't worry if there's a few on. I'm sure it's working fine. Okay,
okay,
Simon.
Great. Fantastic. So with a bit of luck, ladies and gentlemen, now you'll be able to see on my screen the man himself. This is Charles Dickens. Not that he needs any introduction, but that may surprise you to think that that's Charles Dickens you're looking at, because what you're looking at there is a portrait of Charles Dickens painted in 1843, the very year that he wrote A Christmas Carol. Not just the year that he wrote it, but this miniature portrait was painted at the very time that he was writing the novel. And the very first reference that we have to him writing the novel is while he's sitting having this portrait painted. And he's 31 years old. He is young, energetic, full of life, and without that beard that we, of course, associate with Charles Dickens. But he wouldn't grow that beard for another 10 years or so until the early 1850s. And the artist that painted this portrait was a relatively unknown Scottish artist called Margaret Gillies. And she was a very interesting character in her own right. She was a proto-suffragette. She lived in sin with a man called Thomas Southwood Smith, who was the grandfather of Octavia Hill, who went on to become the great social reformer of the sort of mid to late 19th century. So it's interesting that Dickens, of course, was also a social reformer, was sort of in this sort of circle of people. And the portrait was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1844 at the summer exhibition. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the poet, saw the portrait, and she said it had the dust and the mud of humanity about it, notwithstanding those eagle eyes. And I think Margaret Gillies captured that fantastic sort of energy that Dickens had, which drove him his whole literary career. But there's a very interesting story behind the portrait, because after it was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1844, it was gone, disappeared. So a whole mystery ensued about the story of the portrait. And like any good Charles Dickens novel, I'm going to leave you on a cliffhanger. And we're going to come back to what happened to the portrait a little bit later on. But now we're going to find out what Charles Dickens was up to before he wrote A Christmas Carol in 1843. Well, Charles Dickens was already a literary superstar, and he'd already written 4 hit novels, and here they are in order. So his first novel, many of you will know, was called The Posthumous Papers of the Pickwick Club, better known as the Pickwick Papers. Halfway through writing that, he started a second novel, very different story, Oliver Twist, which you can see there on the right-hand side. Halfway through writing Oliver Twist, he writes Nicholas Nickleby, which you can see there on the bottom left. And his fourth novel was called The Old Curiosity Shop, which you can see on the bottom right. And I've put that building on the image because that building is to be found right in the middle of Holborn, right next to Covent Garden. And it's a 16th century building, which we believe possibly was the inspiration for the Old Curiosity Shop itself. This next image is an illustration from the Pickwick Papers. Now, you may all be aware that Dickens wrote in monthly installments, literally leaving a cliffhanger at the end of every chapter. When he wrote the Pickwick Papers, when he wrote the December part or installment, he wrote A Christmas Chapter. And this is Mr. Pickwick skating on the ice, very successfully by the look of it. But I want to show you that because this scene of Mr. Pickwick on the ice proved to be a very popular image for Christmas cards, which we're going to talk about a little bit later on in our story. So just remember that image of Mr. Pickwick. So he's written 4 novels. He's gone to America in 1842 on this now legendary rock star tour. He's come back and he's gone to his publishers and said, I've got this brilliant idea for my next novel, and it's going to be better than all the previous novels I've written. It's going to be even more successful than those. Here it is, Martin Chuzzlewit. And maybe you're all thinking to yourselves, Martin Chuzzlewit, yeah, I've heard of that. I might have read it. I might have seen it on TV or in the film version, but often it's the novel that people haven't yet read that Charles Dickens wrote. And don't be alarmed if you haven't read it, because not many people read it in 1843 either, because it just was not as successful as the previous 4 novels, because quite frankly, it just wasn't as exciting a story. The sales of Martin Chuzzlewit started well enough, 30,000 copies a month, which was about average for Dickens. And then they started to fall off, 20,000 copies, 15,000 copies. He's starting to lose his readers, and his publishers are now losing confidence in their star author. So they threatened to reduce Dickens' monthly income by £50 if the sales continue to fall. Now, this is the last thing that 31-year-old Charles Dickens needs, because he has just taken out a mortgage on a very fine new house near Regent's Park in Marylebone. He's got the 5th of 10 children on the way, and he is the cash cow of the entire family. Everyone relies on Charles Dickens. He can't abandon Martin Chuzzlewit. He needs something else to solve his financial problems. So he's got money worries. Martin Chuzzlewit actually at its heart is the story of a miser, which is very interesting. So Dickens kind of has this idea for a Christmas story. And in the summer and the autumn of 1843, several strands come together which lead to A Christmas Carol. And these are two of them. So this is the first strand. You'll notice here on the image an illustration of children working in Victorian mines. And this illustration accompanied the second parliamentary report on the horrific conditions of child labour in Britain in the 1840s. And what's so interesting about that illustration is that it was done by Margaret Gillies, the same lady that painted Dickens' portrait that I showed you at the beginning. So there was a direct link. Dickens knew her work and presumably commissioned the portrait as a result. Dickens was, he said himself, perfectly stricken down by what he read and what he saw in this parliamentary report. Also, of course, you see the photograph there of children working in the factories in those very dangerous looms. Then Dickens, literally weeks after reading this report, visits this location. Now, this is Field Lane, and this was one of the worst slum districts in London in the mid-19th century. It was right next to the stinking Fleet River, and Dickens already knew it because if you know Oliver Twist, this is where Fagin's den was located, in Field Lane. Now, if you went to visit Field Lane today, this is what it looked like, or what it looks like today. It's Saffron Hill. Saffron Hill. So it's right next to Hatton Garden, the jewellery quarter. So it's quite a different story from the 19th century. But at the time, it was the location of a ragged school, which of course are these schools that the Victorians set up to try and improve the education of poor children. And Dickens was pretty appalled when he went to visit this school at the lack of education that the kids were receiving. So he's got two things on his mind. He's got education, or the lack of it, on his mind. He's got poverty on his mind. And he's decided that he wants to do something that's going to bring around change to the ordinary lives of children. And his first idea is he's going to write a pamphlet, a government pamphlet about the plight of poor children. But then something else happens. He goes up here, he goes up to Manchester, and he goes to this building, which is the Manchester Athenaeum. This provided adult education classes for factory workers. And he gives a talk here on the importance of education. Now, in the north, the poverty was even worse than it was in London. And literally families were starving on the streets. And Dickens decides that a government pamphlet just is not going to cut the ice. He needs something much more powerful. And his own words again, he says, I'm going to write something that delivers a sledgehammer blow on behalf of the innocent victims of the Industrial Revolution. I'm going to write a novel. So here we are, ladies and gentlemen. This is it. This is the cover of the first edition of Christmas Carol. Now, he goes to the publishers. It's October 1843. He's really excited. He says, all my other books have been published in monthly installments, but this one's going to be written as a complete novel. And I want it to be affordable so that everyone can afford to buy it. But I also want it to be a work of art. I want it to be beautiful so that people will buy it as a gift that they can give to their family and friends at Christmas time. Now, at the time, of course, it was pretty difficult for something to be affordable as well as beautiful. And you'll notice here the frontispiece, which is the same image you see behind me, that the illustrations are in colour. Now, this was pretty rare for the 19th century, and of course they were all hand painted, so very expensive. Dickens insisted that it be bound in red cloth, as you just saw, and also that the pages were edged in gold leaf, or at least gilt, not real gold leaf, but still very, very expensive. And in fact, the publishers said, we can't publish this for less than 5 shillings, which would be about £25 today. So very, very expensive. And the publishers refused to pay for the publishing costs. And Dickens was absolutely furious. He said, right, he said, quite literally, sod you, I'm going to self-publish in return for a percentage of the profits. Now, this is a decision that Charles Dickens will later regret. Now, like I said, it's October, ladies and gents, so we've only got 6 weeks till Christmas. Nothing's been written. No illustrator's been appointed. No good publishing A Christmas Story after December the 25th. So he's got a bit of a tight deadline. And amazingly, Dickens manages to write it in 6 weeks. And it nearly finished him off. It nearly broke him. And when he got to the end, he underlined the end 3 times. He was so relieved to have completed it. By December the 19th, it was printed, it was bound, it was finished. 6,000 copies were printed off on the initial print run. It was sold out within 2 days. And another 13,000 copies were printed. By the end of the year, the 2 reprints had sold out as well. So Dickens had a huge hit on his hands. And then he saw the printing bill and he realized that it wasn't quite as financially successful as he planned. Because of the high cost of the production of the pages and the binding, the profits that he'd anticipated of £1,000, which would be about £100,000 today, were reduced to £230, which would be about £23,000 today. So Dickens did not make an awful lot of money. He would later on, of course, make an awful lot of money from A Christmas Carol, not just because, of course, Christmas comes around once a year, but for reasons which will become a little bit clearer later on. But we're going to come back to that. So on with the story, as it were. Flipping over the page, we now see the contents page. Interestingly, Dickens writes Christmas Carol in a series of staves, not chapters. So why write it in staves? Well, because, of course, it's called A Christmas Carol, and therefore it has a musical theme. Now, I'm going to ask a question of everyone here, and feel free to put it in the chat if you want to, if you feel like it. Does anyone know, or can anyone remember, last time you read it or saw a TV or film version of A Christmas Carol? Can you remember what the Christmas Carol is that's referred to in the story? Because it is referenced in the story, but it's only very fleeting. But it is there. So I'll reveal the answer at the end, unless anyone gets it along the way. So you can pop it into the chat function if you feel like it. But we're going to move on, and we're going to move on to the first stave of the story, which is entitled Marley's Ghost. And this, of course, is where we meet the miser of the story, Ebenezer Scrooge, one of the most famous characters in English literature. And it's established that Ebenezer Scrooge works in the City of London. He works in finance, but actually it's not clear what exactly he does. Although Dickens does reference the fact that he invests in mines and properties. So he's some kind of, he's in investments of some description. And he works in a counting house. And again, Dickens is not specific about where this counting house is, but we do have some clues. So now, ladies and gentlemen, we've got the perfect opportunity to use virtual technology to go on a little virtual exploration of the City of London. So here's an aerial view of the city as it is today. I'm sure you are all familiar with the City of London. So what we're looking at down here, of course, is the square mile, the financial district. There's the Bank of England, just there on the bottom left. Here is the Royal Exchange building, just sort of on that little island, which we call Bank Junction. And just running up the right-hand side of the Royal Exchange building is this street called Cornhill. Now, Cornhill will be referenced again later, and that runs essentially it runs west to east in that direction. And then you've got this building, which I've highlighted with a little red pin, and this is a church called St. Michael's Cornhill. And just here to the right of that, tucked behind the church, is a building which is called the Counting House. And there are two entrances to this building. One is tucked away down an alley, which I'll show you later. But the other entrance is from the main road, from Cornhill. Now, this building was once upon a time, in the 19th century, a Victorian bank. And today, this is the building. So we can go right down to street level and look at it. It's called the Counting House Pub. Now, it was originally built as Prescott's Bank in 1893. And actually, it sits on Roman foundations from nearly 2,000 years ago. And it's actually continued to be a bank building right up until the 1980s. It was a NatWest bank. And then Fuller's Brewery took it over, and they transformed the interior into actually one of the most beautiful pubs in London, I think. So this is the interior of the Counting House, all those lovely Victorian interiors. And so this is where we can just imagine Ebenezer Scrooge working, although perhaps not quite such grand surroundings as we see today. Now, if we were to go round the corner from the Counting House, down a series of little alleyways, This is St. Michael's Alley that you now see on the image. We turn the corner and we would come within the shadow of this church. This is St. Michael's Cornhill. And I'll show you a close-up of it just now. Just drop it in for you. Now, why is this important? Because Dickens tells us that the counting house stood in the shadow of an old church whose gruff old bell was always peeping slyly down at old Scrooge from the Gothic window in the wall. Now, if you're familiar with the City of London, you'll know that we have around 38 or so churches in the city, most of them designed by Sir Christopher Wren and rebuilt after the Great Fire of London. But not many of them are Gothic in style. Most of them are classical Baroque. But this is Gothic, and you can see the Gothic windows. So that kind of helps us to pinpoint the location of Scrooge's counting house in the City of London. And I just wanted to show you this illustration. This comes from the Pickwick Papers. Now, if you remember, I said that in the Pickwick Papers, Dickens had written a Christmas chapter. And the chapter, or the number as it was known, ended with a story called The Goblins Who Stole a Sexton. And it's actually a supernatural Christmas story. And in the illustration, you can see on the right, there's a man called Gabriel Grubb. He is a grave digger who cheers himself up on Christmas Eve by digging a grave. And as he's digging the grave, he is suddenly visited by goblins. And you can see a goblin there on the left-hand side. And the goblin takes him on a journey to show him visions of a happier life. So basically, you can see where I'm going with this, can't you? It's the forerunner of A Christmas Carol. So Dickens already had these ideas about 8 years before he wrote A Christmas Carol. Now, of course, Ebenezer Scrooge is described as a grasping, clutching, covetous old sinner, and his name is absolutely, wonderful, and everyone all over the world knows exactly what we mean when we say the word Scrooge. So where did Dickens get this incredible name from? Well, in 1841, Dickens had gone up to Scotland. He'd gone to Glasgow. He'd never been there before. And when Dickens went anywhere for the first time, he went to visit the mortuaries, he went to visit the prisons, he went to visit the workhouses, and he usually went to visit the churchyards and the graveyards. And he goes to a graveyard in Scotland, and this is it. And he's with the name Ebenezer Scroggie on it. Now, as it turns out, Ebenezer Scroggie was an upstanding citizen of Glasgow, and he was a very generous, benevolent man. But Dickens loved the name, and he tucked it away like he did with all of his names, and he thought, I'll use that in the future. And 2 years later, when he comes to write Christmas Carol, he's trying to think of this name, and he thinks about Ebenezer Scroggie. He thinks Scroggie's not quite right. And he uses a mixture of words, including screw. That's fairly obvious, of course, to tighten, but he also uses the word gouge, and he also uses the word scrouge, which was an old slang word for pushing something down tight. And so that combination gives us Scrooge, Ebenezer Scrooge. So it is a fact, in fact, that that the inspiration for Scrooge did come from Scotland, although there are no other stereotypes, of course, associated with that. But if you remember from the story, Scrooge is paid a visit while he's working in his counting house by two charity collectors who are collecting for the poor for Christmas time. Scrooge says that poor people who are unable to work and don't want to be forced into prison or the workhouse should die and decrease the surplus population. And that's one of the most famous lines from the story. And Dickens was really highlighting, I think, how people, or how many people certainly felt about the poor at the time. And I think his point was that he wanted to shame his readers into the fact that a lot of them probably felt the same way as well. Now here we have an illustration of Scrooge talking to his clerk. Now we all probably know that the clerk is called Bob Cratchit, but we don't know his name at this point in the story. We do know that it's Christmas Eve and that his clerk is almost certainly going to want the next day off to spend with his family. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that when Dickens was writing Christmas Carol, is that Christmas Day was, for many people, not a holiday at all. In fact, if you read the Times newspaper on Christmas Day, 1843, you wouldn't have found any mention of Christmas whatsoever in the newspaper. And there'd been no mention of it for about 20 years beforehand. So it's quite interesting that Christmas was no longer the great sort of celebration that it had been in England, certainly sort of way back in the Middle Ages and the Tudor period. It had really lost a lot of its significance. However, Scrooge does reluctantly give Bob Cratchit the next day off, and famously he says, "You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose." And Bob Cratchit says, "If quite convenient, sir." And he says, "It's not convenient and it's not fair." And once a year, sir. And Scrooge says, "Well, I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning." And with that, Bob Cratchit leaves the counting house in a state of excitement, and he actually runs down to Cornhill, and he gets on a tin tray, and Cornhill is covered in ice and snow, and he slides down Cornhill 20 times in honour of it being Christmas Eve. And then he runs all the way home to Camden Town, which is about a 3-mile sprint on Christmas Eve. And Camden Town is significant, as we'll discover in a minute. Now, after locking up the counting house, Scrooge then makes his own way home. And in the text, Dickens tells us that he makes his way to have his usual melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern. And this is, ladies and gentlemen, a little piece of video footage taking us up into Simpson's Tavern, which is just around the corner from St Michael's Cornhill Church. And this has been here since 1757. And this is the tavern we believe that Dickens has in mind where Scrooge takes his melancholy supper. And it's still open today, Monday to Friday, still expanding the waistlines of city financiers to this very day. And you can't get, I think, a more Dickensian location than Simpson's still today in the city of London. Now, then Dickens has Scrooge going home. So where does Ebenezer Scrooge live? Well, here's another little bit of footage that we shot earlier in the year, and it shows you a little courtyard that's, again, tucked away. You'd never find it if you weren't looking for it in the city, and it's called Brabant Court. And just watch the image. Dickens tells us that Scrooge lived in a set of chambers located in a lowering building or a lowering building up a courtyard. And you can just notice the facade there of the building. So I'm going to show you where that exactly is in the city of London. This is the city again today. You're perhaps all familiar with the walkie-talkie building on the left-hand side, which is number 20 Fenchurch Street. But I've put a little arrow just to the right there of the building, and I've dropped a little red pin. And if you look very carefully, you can see that the building I've just shown you on the little film is located just there, just right to the left of the arrow. And I'm going to now go down literally to ground level to show you the front of it. And there it is. It's a very rare example of a lovely early 18th century townhouse, which is in fact inhabited and in fact has undergone a lovely restoration just in the last 2 years. And Dickens even describes the black old gateway that led into the yard. And you can just about see there to the right, the black wrought iron gateway that's still there today. And it's a really nice description that Dickens gives us. He says that the house had run up there when it was a young house during a game of hide and seek, and it had been forgotten about and sort of left there. So it's a really nice description. Now, very famously, of course, Scrooge goes to his front door and there's a knocker on the door, which of course he's seen 100 times. But something very unusual happens this Christmas Eve, is that the door knocker suddenly changes into the face of Dickens' long dead partner, Jacob Marley. And that's, again, a nice illustration from a slightly later edition of A Christmas Carol. And the face of Marley is described as not an impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but it had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. And what's so interesting is that, you know, at the beginning, we hear that wonderful line, Marley was dead to begin with. And of course, Dickens is very clever because he's telling us that it's the beginning of the story, but he's also saying that Marley was dead to begin with, but Marley is coming back to, of course, to forewarn Scrooge of what's about to happen that very same evening. And as Scrooge looks fixedly at the phenomenon, it becomes a knocker once again. Later that evening, Marley appears in ghostly form, and this is the lovely original illustration from the first edition. And there's a lovely, again, sort of very comic element to this, where Dickens says Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. And Marley warns Scrooge that what happened to me is going to happen to you, and you're going to be visited by 3 spirits this very evening. And I wanted to show you this lovely illustration from a later edition, which is from Arthur Rackham's version of Christmas Carol from the early 20th century. And you can see Scrooge looking out of the window, and they do look remarkably like those sash windows from the building. And he sees the air filled with phantoms, and many of them are chained souls who had once been known to Scrooge. So Scrooge is visited by 3 spirits. The first of the 3 spirits is the ghost of Christmas past. And this is where Dickens takes us, the reader, on this really amazing time travel journey. And a writer had not done this before. It was the first time that somebody had used the concept of traveling back in time in a story. So Dickens was way ahead of his time. And Scrooge, of course, sees his life laid out, by somebody else, and he sees the consequences of his actions. And one of the most memorable scenes is this scene where we see Mr. Fezziwig, who had been Scrooge's employer and a very generous employer. And he gave a great ball every year for his employees. And the text tells us that a positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the dance like moons. Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs and come upon his feet again without a stagger. Which I think is lovely. And I want you to notice something just in the left-hand side of the illustration. Can you see that couple just there on the left-hand side? Well, they're under the mistletoe. And I just wanted to reference that because it's the first time that we have, as far as we know, in any illustration in English literature, of a couple kissing under the mistletoe. So actually, it became popular as a result of A Christmas Carol being published. And I just wanted to show you this just because it's so wonderful. If you to visit Covent Garden at Christmas time, this is the installation that they have underneath the market building. So I thought, as we did Covent Garden before, I thought I'd link it in. They have this great big there are 45 giant mistletoe chandeliers hanging from the roof of the indoor market building. And each one is about, I suppose, 3.5 to 7.5 feet in diameter, each with 700 glistening berries. So I thought I'd just put the illustration there, look, of the from the Dickens novel next to the chandeliers. And in fact, the first mention we have of mistletoe in England is 1784 from a Georgian musical. So although of course we understand people have been kissing under the mistletoe for centuries, although you can't do it this year, of course. You can only kiss somebody presumably in your bubble. Anyway, moving on, in case you're wondering who did these beautiful color illustrations, they're done by this man. This is John Leach, and he was most famous for being the chief caricaturist of Punch magazine, and that's an illustration of him from Punch magazine itself. Now, Scrooge is made to feel very nostalgic as a result of this journey into the past, and he can't bear to see any more of it. So he finally gets rid of the first of the 3 spirits by extinguishing the light of the ghost using an extinguisher cap. No sooner is one spirit gone than a second appears, and this is the ghost of Christmas present. And I think visually, probably this is the most memorable of all of the ghosts. And here's the illustration to prove it. And what we get here is the personification, really, of the figure of Christmas as people understood it in the 19th century. Christmas in English culture certainly was a jolly green giant, a man wearing a flowing green robe trimmed with white fur, holly leaves around the head, and he's very much based on the Green Man, this pagan sort of idea. And you've got the holly berries, and you've got the mistletoe there, and you've got greenery. But of course, we don't get obviously the image of the red and white Santa Claus until late 19th century. And of course, largely it's an American sort of invention based on the original image of St. Nicholas. But this is what people understood Christmas to represent in England at the time. And notice that there is an awful lot of food surrounding the Ghost of Christmas Present. You've got turkeys and geese, and you've got plum puddings, and you've got lots of wonderful food, because that's really what Christmas meant at the time, was this great, food feast. People didn't really give gifts at Christmas time at this time. The gifts were generally given on the 6th of January. So it's very much a food festival. And the one thing that you wouldn't have seen in any Victorian home until about 10 years after A Christmas Carol was published was a Christmas tree. So that's quite interesting. Does anyone know, by the way, who introduced the decorated Christmas tree to England? Anyone know? You can put it in the chat if you think you know the answer. And most people, when they guess, normally...
Prince Albert.
Well done, Prince Albert. That's right, Prince Albert. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Well, they certainly were responsible for making the Christmas tree extremely popular, but we can't credit them, I'm afraid, technically, with introducing the Christmas tree to England. So we're going to have to credit somebody else, and it's this lady. Hang on, there we are. So there she is. This is actually Queen Victoria's grandmother. Anyone know her name? She's the wife of King George III.
Georgiana.
Good guess. Yeah, not Georgiana. It's actually Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Yes, and you can't get much more German than that, can you? She was very definitely German, and we have a diary entry of her bringing this yew tree to Windsor Castle for Christmas time, and it was described as a German tradition, but it wouldn't have had decorations on it. But it was really the beginning of a Christmas tree in England. But of course, you're quite right, the people that said Victoria and Albert, because what happens is that Queen Victoria, who of course grew up in Kensington Palace and remembered the Christmas tree, then she and her husband Prince Albert introduced it in a big way. And this is from the London Illustrated News in 1848, and it shows you Victoria and Albert now with a decorated tree with live candles on it. And of course, once people saw this, within about 10 years, of course, all the Victorian middle class wanted to copy the royal family, and suddenly every home must have one. So that's really how it started. But Charles Dickens would not have known a Christmas tree, or even the concept of a Christmas tree, when he was growing up or as a young man. So I think that's quite an interesting point to make. By the way, somebody has in fact guessed the name of the Christmas Carol. So well done. It is God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. So what happens is a young boy sings it through the letterbox of the counting house, and if you remember, Scrooge shoos him away. Yeah, so that is indeed the Christmas Carol. Now, moving on, what happens is that the Ghost of Christmas Present then takes Scrooge on this journey to show him how people are celebrating Christmas in the present, in his own lifetime. And the most important scene that takes place is Scrooge is shown how Bob Cratchit and his family celebrate Christmas. And I'm just going to show you now an image of a house which is 16 Bayham Street in Camden Town. This building no longer exists, but the street still survives. And the reason I'm showing it to you is because this is where Charles Dickens lived when he was a child. When he was 9, going on 10 years old, he joined his family, who had moved here from Chatham in Kent, and within a few months, you might know the story, his father got into terrible debt, and the family ended up moving into a debtor's prison, and poor young Charles Dickens ends up getting a job in a blacking factory on the site of where Charing Cross railway station is today. And so for about a year, Charles Dickens was a child labourer, effectively. And of course, that's what, of course, really cemented his whole, his whole life. So Dickens always denied that he used real life people and real life locations in his stories, but he did. And that's why the Cratchits live in Camden Town. And it was described as the poorest part of the London suburbs. And actually Camden Town at the time overlooked the countryside in the early 19th century. So it was still very much semi-rural. Now they go, so Scrooge goes to visit the Cratchit family. Now remember, Scrooge at this point, I mean, knows nothing about Bob Cratchit's family. He doesn't care, not interested. But they do, of course, make the most of their Christmas celebrations, despite the fact they've hardly got any money. And this is an illustration of how the majority, I suppose, of Victorians, ordinary Victorian people, celebrated Christmas Day. This is a scene of people carrying their Christmas dinner back home. So for the majority of people, of course, the Christmas bird on Christmas Day would have been not turkey, as it is today, but goose, because goose was much more affordable. Turkey was much more expensive. And most Victorians couldn't afford, of course, to have an oven in their homes. So they would take the bird to the house or the cook shop, have it baked for a small fee, and then they'd carry it home. That's what you see in that illustration. And in fact, the Cratchit children, the older boys, are sent to the cook shop to go and fetch the goose. So you quite literally had your goose cooked by somebody else. And I just thought I'd show you this because some of you might recognize this interior, and we might actually, I think I might have even touched on it when we did the Covent Garden tour. I usually do, but this is the interior of the oldest restaurant in London, Rule's Restaurant, all decorated for Christmas. And of course, interestingly, they would have been open on Christmas Day this year. They don't normally open Rule's Restaurant, but they would have been. But of course, because of a level tier 4, they weren't able to. But of course, this is where one might go for a very traditional, of course, English Christmas lunch. And anyone know, by the way, of course, turkey is the traditional bird in this country, and I suppose in America too as well. But anyone know who introduced the turkey? It was actually, again, it was royal family. Which monarch introduced the turkey to England? Anyone know? And it's not actually the Victorians, surprisingly, although they're responsible for a lot of our Christmas traditions. But anyone? It's the most gluttonous thing a king you can think of. Yeah, it's this one. Henry VIII. Henry VIII was the first monarch, we understand, to eat turkey. And the man that was responsible, we believe, for bringing turkey to England was a man called William Strickland, and he brought it from the Americas. And I just want to show you this, because this is the coat of arms that was made for William Strickland in the 1520s. And look what's on the top of it. It's a turkey. And that is apparently the first known illustration we have of a turkey in England from the 1500s. Now, of course, before that, the royals had eaten, exotic birds like, peacock, of course, often several birds stuffed into another, a bit like Russian dolls. But turkey, I suppose, was kind of much tastier and probably had less stringy flesh than other birds. And so it became very important. But it doesn't really become, well, it becomes popular because of A Christmas Carol, actually, because, of course, at the end of the story, the Cratchits do get a turkey as a result of Scrooge's generosity. And then Queen Victoria mentions having a turkey in 1851. And so, again, everyone wants to have a turkey. But it wasn't really till after the Second World War that turkey becomes, I suppose, the most popular dish. Now, after the Cratchits have their goose, they, of course, have the plum pudding. And this is Mrs. Cratchit bringing in the plum pudding. And there's a lovely description where Bob Cratchit says it was the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. And it's called a plum pudding, not made with plums, of course, but raisins or dried prunes. And it's actually 5 years after Christmas Carol is published that we get the first written reference to a Christmas pudding rather than a plum pudding. And as you might know, if you went back to the Middle Ages, the pudding was in fact a savoury dish. It was actually much more like a haggis, cooked in an animal's stomach, and it was made of meat rather than sweet ingredients. And gradually over time, the sweet ingredients took over the savoury ingredients. And I'm just going to show you this because, of course, we have this tradition, don't we, of pouring brandy over a Christmas pudding and setting fire to it. Of course, in the 17th century, Oliver Cromwell and his Puritans banned Christmas. Christmas was banned because, of course, it wasn't mentioned in the Bible. So if it wasn't mentioned in the Bible, you shouldn't be celebrating it. And therefore, along with all the traditions, they banned Christmas pudding. Apparently, they thought that setting fire to something was reminiscent of a pagan fire festival. And so they banned the Christmas pudding. Now, we move on to the next illustration, which is Bob Cratchit after they've eaten Christmas dinner and proposing a toast to the entire family. And there's a lovely scene where Bob makes up this bowl of hot punch, which is a cheap version of punch. It's not made with, it's a mulled wine, but it's not made with wine because that would have been too expensive. It's made with gin. And we see, in fact, the Cratchits all drinking from this gin concoction. And the Temperance Society were absolutely furious with Dickens for having depicted children drinking alcohol at Christmas time. Now, the other thing to mention here is, can you see, we've got an image there of Tiny Tim. And Tiny Tim, of course, is the youngest of the Cratchit children. He is disabled. Dickens isn't specific about what disability Tiny Tim has, but a doctor, an American doctor just a few years ago, looked at the symptoms from the description in the text, and he worked out that Tiny Tim was suffering from apparently a very common kidney disease in the 19th century. And if you're really interested in this, it's known as distal renal tubular acidosis, which was basically something that could have been treated in the 19th century if you could have afforded medical care, which of course the Cratchits can't. And if you couldn't treat it, you ended up with these symptoms, including sort of weakness, I think vitamin and mineral deficiencies, anemia, and so on. Now, the reason I'm really going into this is because Scrooge, of course, takes an interest in this child, and he's very concerned. And he says to the ghost, "Tell me if Tiny Tim will live." And the ghost says, "I see a vague... If the shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." And then he says, if he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population. And for the first time, Scrooge is really now overcome with penitence, haunted by his own terrible words from earlier on. Now, just before the Ghost of Christmas Present disappears, something extraordinary happens. And I really think this is the most important illustration in the whole story. It's certainly the point that Dickens wanted to make. It was really the heart of the story, and it's the part that's often left out of the film and the television versions. And what you see here is Scrooge looking under the robes of the spirit, and he says, "Forgive me if I'm not justified in what I ask, but I see something strange protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?" And what in fact it is, as you see, are two children. And they're described as yellow, ragged, wolfish, but menacing. And Scrooge says, "Are they yours?" And the spirit says, "They are man's. The boy is ignorance, the girl is want. Beware them both and all of their degree. But most of all, beware this boy. For on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased." And Scrooge says, "Well, have they no refuge? Have they no resources?" And again, the spirit says, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" Turning the words against Scrooge. And it's really interesting because the illustration shows factories behind the spirit, as you can see. And these represent the factories of the industrial north in Manchester, which of course Dickens had visited. So the Ghost of Christmas Present disappears, and Scrooge is visited one last time by the last of the spirits, the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, and in many ways the most frightening of them all. This is the spirit that doesn't speak. He's a silent phantom that moves like a mist along the ground towards Scrooge. I think the important point about this is that Scrooge has decided that he's going to change his ways already, and he's hoping that the spirit's going to show him a kinder and more considerate version of himself in the next part of the story. But in fact, what happens is the spirit takes him here. Now, this is, you may recognize it, the Royal Exchange building in the heart of the City of London. And it's just to the right of the Bank of England. And the street that runs up to the right is Cornhill. So all these locations that Dickens had in mind are all within just a few minutes walk of each other, right in the heart of the city. Now, this, of course, was where all the merchants worked in the 19th century. This is where Scrooge would have gone almost certainly on a daily basis. And Dickens would have seen that building under construction in 1843 because the previous building had burnt down in a fire in 1838, and this wasn't opened until 1844. In fact, you can just about see Queen Victoria's name is just above the column. So next time you're in the City of London, do have a good look at the front of the Royal Exchange building. And this is what Scrooge is shown. He's shown a group of well-fed, wealthy merchants, just like himself. And they're talking about a man that's died. And a rather red-faced gentleman with a pendulous excrescence on the end of his nose that shook like the gills of a turkey cock says, "What has he done with his money?" Another man says, "I haven't heard. Left it to his company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me. That's all I know." And Scrooge has not yet worked out that they're talking about him. And in the final part of this scene, Scrooge is taken to a dismal, wretched, ruined churchyard, almost certainly this church, which is St. Peter's Cornhill, which is next to St. Michael's Cornhill. And the silent ghost simply stands among the gravestones and points towards one of them. And Scrooge, of course, now gets very concerned, and he says, "Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they the shadows of the things that may be only?" And still the ghost continues to point. And this is, again, wonderful illustration of Scrooge confronted with his own name on the gravestone. And this is where he finally calls out in horror, "I'm not the man I was. I will honor Christmas in my heart. I will try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future." And he grabs hold of the ghost's rather spectral hand, and it shrinks, collapses, and disappears into a bedpost. And Scrooge pulls open the curtains of his bed and realizes that it's Christmas Day and that he hasn't missed it. And he finds out it's Christmas Day by calling down to a young boy who's outside on the street. And he tells the young boy to run round to the poulterer's in the next street and buy the prize turkey in the window. Not the little one, but the big one, and send it to Bob Cratchit's house. And the poulterer's that Dickens refers to is located here. And again, you might recognize that building. That's Leadenhall Market. It was built, well, the present building was built in 1881, but certainly the building that preceded it was also a Victorian building. And if we look closely on the left-hand side of the arcade, we would still see today the butcher's hooks. So we can just picture the turkeys and the geese and the game hanging from the hooks in the market. So again, and that's just around the walkie-talkie, just around the corner from Scrooge's counting house and the chambers. So again, all right next door to each other. And the next day, if you remember, Bob Cratchit has been asked to be at the counting house all the earlier the next morning. And Scrooge, of course, is now going to play a trick on him because he's hoping that Bob Cratchit's going to be late for work, which of course he is. And he waits as Bob Cratchit tries to sneak into his little sort of cubbyhole. And Scrooge says, "What do you mean by coming here at this time of day?" And Cratchit says, "I'm very sorry, sir. I'm behind my time." And he says, "Yes, I think you are. Step this way, if you please." It's only once a year, sir. It won't be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir." "I'll tell you what," says Scrooge, "I will not stand for this sort of thing any longer. And therefore, I'm about to raise your salary. A Merry Christmas, Bob. A merrier Christmas than I have shown you for many a year. I'm going to raise your salary. I'm going to assist your struggling family, and we'll discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop." And there you see the illustration of Scrooge and Bob Cratchit enjoying smoking bishop. Now, smoking bishop was a rather rich mulled wine, and it was called smoking bishop because it was a beautiful, deep burgundy purple color, as like a bishop's surplice. So that's brings us almost to the end of the story, when, of course, Scrooge has now become the most generous and most genial man that the City of London has ever seen, and he goes on to make Bob Cratchit a partner in the business. But before we conclude, just a couple of other things, because remember the next day when Bob Cratchit turns up for work, that's the day that we now know as Boxing Day. But again, Boxing Day was, for most people, a working day, as in Bob Cratchit's case. But just thought I'd bring in there we are, image of a boxing glove. Not that we need to be reminded, but of course, Boxing Day traditionally was when the alms boxes in the churches were opened up on December the 26th, and the alms were distributed to the poor of the parish. Hopefully they would have been filled in the run-up until Christmas, and poor people relied upon those charitable donations probably to pay their quarterly rent, which was usually due, by the way, on the 25th of December, the day before. And of course, it was also a day given to servants who had served, usually on Christmas Day, the Lord and Master. And the reason I mention it is because it's the first mention we have of Boxing Day is 1833, but it's made more popular by Charles Dickens in the Pickwick Papers. And he says that it brings joy to employees because many of them are given the day off. And he says, no man ever talked in poetry except a beadle on Boxing Day. So that's in the Pickwick Papers. Now, before we do finish, just a little bit of the legacy of A Christmas Carol. Now, remember I said it hadn't made Dickens an awful lot of money to begin with. Within probably about 8 weeks of the publication of the story, there were 8 different stage versions of A Christmas Carol. And this is a poster of the production that was at the Adelphi Theatre in the West End in February 1844. Now, Dickens had no control over any of these stage adaptations. He had no financial investment in them. He made no money from them because there was no, he had no control over copyright, unfortunately for him. And these are the stage illustrations of that particular production. You'll see the stage designs and the costume designs are inspired by the original John Leech drawings. But Dickens did go on to make an awful lot of money from A Christmas Carol, and he did it in this particular way. 10 years after he wrote the novel, so 1853, on the 27th of December, he's invited up to Birmingham to address a crowd of people. Now, he's quite used to giving talks and lectures, but this time he decides, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to read from A Christmas Carol. And this embarks Dickens on a whole new career, reading his work out loud for his audiences. And he did that for the rest of his life up until his death in 1870. Now, initially, the money went to charity. And then, quite rightly, I suppose, it went into Dickens' back pocket. And Dickens made more money from the public readings of his own novels than he ever made from the novels themselves. Now, when you think about the way, a writer today, a book tour is part of a writer's life, isn't it? You mean that they have to go to Waterstones and all the big bookstores or the literary festivals, and, they read out loud quite often from their stories. But this had never been done before. So Dickens was a pioneer in this regard. Now, of course, he didn't just read from the novel, he performed it, because Dickens was at heart an actor. He'd wanted to be an actor ever since he was a child. And this is the special copy of A Christmas Carol that Dickens had made, which you can see his annotations on, which he used to bring the story to life. And I just wanted to show you this building, which I'm sure many of you will recognize the exterior of. This is the Charles Dickens Museum. This is number 48 Doughty Street in Bloomsbury. This is the only surviving London home of Charles Dickens, and it's where he lived for nearly 3 years. It's where he finished the Pickwick Papers. It's where he wrote Oliver Twist, and it's where he started Nicholas Nickleby. And it's from here that he moved to the bigger house in Marylebone when he's writing A Christmas Carol. And the reason, of course, I want to show you that is because, A, it's a wonderful museum, and let's hope we all get a chance to visit our museums and galleries very soon again. But one of the treasures of the Charles Dickens Museum is this reading desk. And this is the lectern that Dickens had made to read from on those public reading tours. Now, we're nearly at the end of our story, but not quite. In 1867 and 1868, Dickens went back to America, and he embarked on an American reading tour. And you've got to imagine these readings were so popular that people camped overnight in the streets to buy tickets at the box office. If they couldn't get tickets, they went to ticket touts or scalpers who sold tickets at inflated prices, just like they used to do for the musicals, you know, in the West End years ago. When he went to Washington, D.C., President Johnson bought tickets for his family every single night. And Dickens made $140,000 on that American tour. About £90,000 today, a huge amount of money. And when he got back to New York to get on the steamer to come back to England in 1868, the federal tax collectors were waiting for him because he refused to pay taxes on his American income, mainly because he was angry at the fact that the Americans had not taken up the cause of international copyright. And I couldn't resist, ladies and gents, just for a bit of fun, just showing you this modern Ebenezer Scrooge, if ever there was one. And let's just hope those federal tax collectors are still there today and maybe hot on the heels of somebody else in the next few weeks and months. And by the way, I must just tell you that on the 24th of December, on Christmas Eve 1867, Dickens read in Boston to a crowd of thousands of people, and a factory owner was so moved by the story of the conversion of Ebenezer Scrooge that he gave all of his employees the next day off and sent them all home with a turkey. This is the last illustration that we've got of Charles Dickens reading from the novels. This was in March 1870, and in June 1870, Charles Dickens was dead as a doornail at the age of 58 years old. So amazingly young age. He was really stress and over-exhaustion had finished him off. And when a little flower girl was walking through Covent Garden Market, she overheard two men talking about Charles Dickens' death. And she went up to them and she said, "Charles Dickens dead? Will Father Christmas die as well?" And that's how much Dickens meant to his audience, both old and young alike. Now, I'm sure for many of us, our very first introduction to A Christmas Carol was perhaps through a television or a film version. And I've just picked out some of the most well-known. Maybe some of you will know these. You might have your favorite. The very classic version, of course, is Alistair Sim, just on the left there in black and white, which again is terrific. There is a wonderful musical version of the story with Albert Finney done in the 1970s, which was also a stage version, which I saw in the 1980s, but that's on the bottom left. Then, of course, you've got the Muppets version, which I think is my second favourite version of the story, with Michael Caine as Ebenezer Scrooge and the Muppets there. And then you've got the animated version that was done by Disney about, I think, 8 years ago now, very, very high-tech version with Jim Carrey voicing Ebenezer Scrooge. But I have to say my personal favourite is the version in the middle, which was done in 1984 with George C. Scott, the American actor, as Ebenezer Scrooge. And the reason I love it so much is because it was filmed in Shrewsbury in Shropshire, which is where I'm from originally. And I remember when it was all being filmed on location in the town, lots of wonderful Victorian buildings, and people that I knew were extras in the version. So I have a real soft spot for that version. And I found a new version, which I hadn't seen, which I watched this year on Christmas Eve, which I'll tell you about. Anyway, we're nearly now at the very end of the story, but I said I wouldn't leave you on that cliffhanger that I gave you at the beginning. We're going to finish how we started with the portrait. So remember I said 1844, exhibited at the Royal Academy, and then the portrait disappeared. Dickens was dead in 1870. In the 1880s, the artist Margaret Gillies was still alive, and she was asked what had happened to this miniature portrait. She said, "I don't know. It's lost." Fast forward to 2018, and a South African collector contacted the Philip Mould Art Gallery in St. James in the West End to ask their advice about a miniature portrait that they had found covered in fungus and in mould at the bottom of a box of junk that they bought for £27 at an auction. And the conservators cleaned up the portrait that you see here, and to their amazement, underneath they started to see this very handsome young Victorian gentleman, and very quickly they realized it was this lost portrait of Charles Dickens from 1843. And in October 2019, the Art Fund, the Arts Council, thousands of individual donations led to the completion of a fundraising appeal of £185,000, and the portrait was bought for the nation forever. And I'm delighted to tell you it sits in the study, in the Dickens Museum in Bloomsbury, opposite Charles Dickens' writing desk. And it's a reminder of this young idealistic man who really wanted to make the world a kinder and more charitable place. And as his friend Mr. Thackeray said after the publication of A Christmas Carol, that he had done a national benefit of kindness to humanity. That's how A Christmas Carol was described. And on that very positive note, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to come back out. You can all switch your videos on.